Greetings, salams and welcome to the first discussion in the series of talks titled Empires, Converts and Community, Connecting with Britain's Muslim Heritage. This pioneering series will be hosted by me, Tariq Hussain, over the next 6 Fridays as I enter into discussions with many of the world's leading scholars and practitioners about the long neglected Muslim heritage of Britain. In many ways, the series couldn't have come at a better time. As the world around us begins to change and students of history demand their curriculums be revised, through this series, we will also present another history of Britain that does not appear on the curriculum. The series focuses on the fascinating period between the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th, when the world witnessed the gradual decline and abolition of two of history's largest empires, the British and the Ottomans. It also witnessed the start of 2 world wars, and in Britain, the establishment of its very first Muslim communities. Over the next 6 weeks, we will unveil the lives of some of Britain's most influential and forgotten Muslim personalities, and the stories behind many British Muslim heritage spaces from this era. Guests will also reveal tangible ways to connect with this heritage today. Our first session is called Britain's First Muslim Community, through Empire, Early Converts, Mosques, Archives, and New Muslim Heritage Trails. And to talk about this today, I have with me Professor Humayun Ansari, who I should point out is called Sarah's iPad on the screen, because he didn't type his name in, just so you know who it is that I'm talking about. He is one of the world's leading experts on Islam in Britain, and he will help to set the scene for the entire series. I also have with me Sadiya Ahmed, the founder of the Everyday Muslim Heritage and Archive Project, which has done some brilliant grassroots work to make Britain's Muslim heritage more visible and accessible. Sadiya is joined by one of her project's key ambassadors, Tanya Muneera Williams, who is also a poet, cultural producer, writer, and broadcaster. Thank you all for agreeing to be on the show today. So before we get stuck into this fascinating history, just to reiterate what Mijan Bhai said earlier, there will be an opportunity to ask our guests any questions you might have. So please do put them in the chat or simply ask directly via Zoom during the Q&A session. Okay, so let's start with you, Professor Ansari. Can you please begin to set the scene for this period by detailing Britain's relationship with Muslims and Muslim countries?
Thank you very much, Tariq. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Delighted to contribute. Great series that you've got here. What I would like to do in terms of setting the scene is to respond really to some deeply held or entrenched, if you like, perceptions and stereotypes regarding Islam and Muslims in Britain. So it seems to me that there are 2 perceptions of the British Muslim communities that have endured historically. First, that of an homogeneous, isolationist social collectivity that broadly resists modern secular norms, values, and processes of change. This perception ignores the visible evidence of the ongoing fusion that is taking place between Muslims and British society. Instead of mutual goodwill, the result has been division, distrust, and Islamophobia. Up, slide 1, please. Yeah.
Slide 1.
Could I have the slide 1 up? Yeah.
Is it
Have you got the slide 1 up? Okay, I'll just carry on. Yeah. That's it. Great. Thank you. But if we look at history, nothing could be further from the reality of British Muslims' lived experience. Indeed, the most striking aspect associated with Muslims living in Britain today is the diversity that they represent. This is clearly reflected in the wide range of distinct cultures, languages, and political traditions that we find around us. South Asian, Middle Eastern, African, and indeed European. The other popular perception in British society is that Islam is an alien religion, that it arrived here only recently with no deep historical and organic links with the customs, traditions, and values of British society, such as those claimed for Christianity and even Judaism. Again, this view belies historical scrutiny and denies Muslims legitimacy, ownership, and stake in their British homeland. By looking at the historical evolution of Britain's Muslim communities, I want to demonstrate their rootedness and entitlements, and to argue that the British Muslims have as much claim on this land as anybody else living here today. So, what is this history? Well, contrary to popular perception, the relationship between Muslims and the British Isles goes back close to the beginning of Islam. A gold dinar, as you can see, from the 8th century in the British Museum, bearing the Quranic verses in Arabic Kufic script, referring to the fundamentals of the Islamic faith, along with the name of King Offa of Mercia, suggests that awareness of and commercial interaction with the Muslim world has was as early as the 8th century. The range of Muslim interactions with the English continued to widen and deepen in the following centuries. An interesting instance was Elizabeth I's offer in 1588 to enter into an alliance with Murad III, whom she considered a fellow monotheist, to bring about the downfall of the papist and idolatrous King of Spain. From this period onwards, commercial, political, and military interactions developed between Britain and Turkey, bringing an increasing number of Muslim sailors, traders, and official functionaries, corsairs, and pirates off the North African coast, many of whom settled here permanently. So by 1725, society here was pretty well accustomed to the Muslim presence, though they were still offensively described as the followers, and I quote, licentious false prophet. In the following centuries, the carve-up of Asia and Africa, however, left few Muslim countries outside Europe's sphere of influence. As early as the 1600s, the East India Company had already become the main employer of Indians coming to Britain. The returning English brought back Indian servants. At the same time, the desire to experience a culture, glimpses of which promised richness and sophistication, stimulated Muslims to travel to Europe. Up, slide 2, please. Yeah. So we have Sayyid-Din Muhammad arriving with his employer, Captain Baker, in 1784. He was one of the first to settle permanently in England. He opened the first ever Indian restaurant in London in 1810, then moved to the increasingly fashionable health resort of Brighton. There, his shampooing and herbal vapor baths business eventually became a roaring success, with King George IV as one of his illustrious clients. As the British tightened their grip over Muslim territories, there began a trickle of the members of Muslim elites associated with the British authority and students belonging to upper and middle classes arriving here. Other Muslims, a motley crew, came in search of adventure and opportunities. Among the men of enterprise who gravitated to his industrial and commercial centers in order to further their ambition were Moroccan and other Arab merchants, lured, for instance, by Manchester's position as the textile manufacturing capital of the world. Very different to the Ottoman representatives, who enjoyed diplomatic status and the privileged few from India were those Muslims who arrived in Britain as servants and ayahs, nannies or ladies' maids, to returning East India Company employees. A particularly significant group of migrants to arrive in Britain during the 19th century was maritime workers or lascars. By 1842, an astonishing 10 to 12,000 were arriving at British ports. The majority of them were Muslims, referred to as, again I quote, the deluded followers of the licentious doctrines of a false prophet in the more virulent evangelical circles. On ships, they were treated brutally, some reportedly being hung with weights tied to their feet, flogged with a rope, and forced to eat pork. It was little wonder then that an increasing number began to jump ship, prepared to take their chances in London's East End. They were joined by Yemeni and Somali seamen, together with Ottoman Turks, particularly after the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. And apart from London, proceeded to settle in large numbers in ports such as Cardiff, Glasgow, and Liverpool. Moving on to the early 20th century, we note that the First World War caused a substantial acceleration of migration from these parts of the empire that had traditionally provided cheap labor in the past to replace British men called up for war duty. This demand was met in part by importing labor largely from the colonies. As a consequence, the number of Muslim seamen increased greatly in all British ports. So what we find is that the Muslims who settled in Britain in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were a highly differentiated population in ethnic and class terms. The experience British society at the time, experienced British society at the time when it was passing through the peak of its imperial power and when it viewed colonial subjects as inferiors who deserved to be treated less than equally. Islam was denounced as an abomination. The 4 times liberal Prime Minister Gladstone, whose father, I mean, this is, I suppose, quite topical, owned slaves and who himself opposed the abolition of slavery, called the Quran that accursed book. In 1899, Winston Churchill, not long ago, as you know, voted the greatest Briton ever, denounced Islam for its fatalistic apathy, according to him, its degraded sensualism, and its treatment of women as absolute property. For him, and I quote again, the fanatical frenzy of Muslims was as dangerous in a man as hydrophobia, rabies, in a dog. Images and themes of Muslims, the Muslim despotism, corruption, religious fanaticism, sexual depravity, and inequality depicted in literature, painting, and travel writing came to inform popular attitudes towards the small but growing Muslim population in Britain, and in turn led by and large to negative evaluations of discriminatory and with discriminatory effects for individual Muslims in key spheres of their lives. Now, that said, the picture was not entirely bleak. Some Britons with more intimate engagement with Muslims and Muslim societies arrived at a decidedly positive evaluation of Islam as a progressive moral force and were happy themselves to become Muslims. Up 3, slide 3, please. Slide 3.
It's up.
Okay. This extremely interesting group of British Muslims requires further elaboration. Leading converts included Earl Stanley of Alderley, Robert Rashid Stanley, Mayor of Stalybridge, Lord Headley, the translator of the Holy Quran, Marmaduke Pictou, Sir Archibald Hamilton, Deputy Surgeon General in the Royal Navy, and his wife, and Lady Evelyn Zainab Cobbold, the first British woman to perform the pilgrimage. Now, let's move to, there is Abdullah Quilliam there, but I want to talk a little bit more about him. So slide 4. Okay. One of the most prominent was William Abdullah Quilliam, of whom, as I just said, you'll hear a great deal more in subsequent sessions. He a reputable solicitor from the Isle of Man. Here, I just want to highlight the Islamophobic challenges that the early Muslims faced. After his conversion in 1887, he set up the Liverpool Muslim Institute. You can see the sort of mosque there in the slide. He came under attack almost immediately. He was denounced as a lunatic. His system of religious belief was pronounced as a quote, unmitigated nonsense, a belief utterly foreign to Western mind, an un-English religion, this Eastern humbug, which, as history had proved, had been hand in glove with cruelty, murder, moral and imperial decay, and barbarous ferocity, unquote. In this anti-Muslim climate, his task of propagating Islam became extremely challenging. How then did Quilliam go about it? To his largely Protestant audience, he emphasized the continuity between Christianity and Islam. He attempted to make connections with the religious practices of potential converts, and so create a sense of receptive familiarity. This was reflected in many of the LMI's activities, which were similar to the good works being carried out vigorously by nonconformist Christians, especially the Unitarians. For example, its annual celebration of Christmas Day from 1888. The LMI also built bridges with interested Christians by adopting a form of ritual to which people were accustomed and with which they felt at home. Morning and evening services were organized on Sundays, where hymns, many taken from Christian evangelists, but adapted by Quilliam to be suitable, according to him, for English-speaking congregations, and accompanied by the organ that was placed in the mosque, and they were sung. In these ways, Quilliams began to construct an indigenous British Islamic tradition with some success. His congregation, estimated at around 200, was there by the early 20th century. Now, in the early 20th century, Muslims elsewhere in Britain adopted equally dating strategies with much success. The modernist Muslim mission set up in 1913 by Khwaja Kamaluddin at the Shah Jahan Mosque, the first purpose of the mosque at Woking, was at pains to display flexibility and patience towards new Muslims who strove to give up values and habits which had played a central role in their pre-Muslim lives. Its ecumenical spirit and practice can be gauged from the fact that the Agha Khan Sayyid Amir Ali, who wrote that famous Spirit of Islam, also a member of the Privy Council here, Abdullah Yusuf Ali, whose translation and tafsir of the Quran is reputed as a classic work. And these were people who were associated with the Woking mission from very early on. So much of these Muslims' work was conducted with a light touch, in a convivial atmosphere, with due regard for the social etiquette, conventions and customs, modes of conduct and practices current at the time. British cultural forms were adopted to give as little an impression of strangeness as possible. Hence, festivities were celebrated at prestigious hotels and restaurants. You've got a picture of one there on the slide. At one such occasion, for instance, Maulvi Inayat Khan, who arrived in 1912, a newly arrived Sufi Muslim, presented a rendition of Indian classical music on the sitar, and a number of English ladies followed suit with recitals on the piano and violin. At homes became a regular feature of their religious intercourse, encouraged and facilitated this intermingling process, especially through such bodies as the British Muslim Society, which was established in 1914. In its monthly journal, the Islamic Review, ideas were presented in various ways that suggested that Islam could be relevant to people's lives in the British environment, and that it was not an alien presence in the, which I referred to earlier, in their midst, indeed no more so than Christianity itself. They were addressing some of the questions that continue to have resonance even today: apostasy and the punishment for it, the question of parda, hijab, and women's position in Islam, and approaches to music and art. Here we can see much modernist interpretation of scripture, flexibility of thought and practice as they navigated British society. Finally, the poorer classes of Muslims, numbering several thousands, on the other hand, in order to avoid conflict, adopted voluntary separation in Britain's ports and industrial centers, shunning social intermingling. While segregation inevitably created social distance, it did enable them to establish communities in which they could preserve self-respect and retain a distinctive sense of identity. However, the sheer imbalance of numbers and power relationships involved meant that they acquiesced in the subordinate position by accepting roles which the host society considered appropriate for them. While holding fast to at least some of their values, they adopted a largely pragmatic approach to culture, custom, and religion in order to achieve workable compromises with their social environment. What we can see in these broad patterns of interaction between Muslims and the wider communities are the variations, some quite complex in character, as well as different responses of being Muslim in Britain. We see the dynamic fusion of Muslim and British culture. So to conclude, reflecting on this historical journey that I have taken you through, while it is possible to identify Muslims as revolving around certain key ideas and practices, what I've crucially sought to do is catch the spirit in which these core ideas and practices were constantly negotiated by Muslims in concrete historical circumstances, representing a constantly evolving tradition, constantly churning in its crucible different cultures at local, regional, and national levels, encompassing innumerable individual, familial, ethnic, racial, and gender identities. That's it.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for that whirlwind tour through Britain's Muslim history, Professor. I have to confess, I lumbered the Professor with the most unfair role in this series, because he's having to cover nearly, 1,400 years of history and try and contextualize it all for us, whilst those who are going to follow in the series after this one, they're all going to get to come and talk about, individuals and particular spaces and focus on a lot of the figures and the places that the Professor has kind of introduced to us at this moment in time. So I have to thank you again, and I have to apologize again for making you squeeze all of that into such a short space. But one thing I'm certain of is that all our viewers will be left with the impression that Britain has certainly had a long history with Islam and Muslims. Now, if I may, I'd like to bring in Sadiya. First of all, Sadiya, before we start, what is your project about, and why do you think archiving of history is so important?
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Professor Ansari. So, it's such a difficult question. It feels like I'm having to explain everything Professor Ansari did, but in a different way. So, I come from a non-expert, non-historic, non-archiving background, and I didn't know any of the histories that Professor Ansari just spoke about, and came across a few when just being on the internet and became more interested in what those stories were and how our stories and we connected with them, and not being able to connect community with academia, and then visiting the archives very briefly and not finding much about Muslim life, which I just assumed that it would be there because it's the heritage organisation's responsibility to be archiving and representing British communities, of which I assumed I was, and not finding us there was probably why our project focuses on creating archives. So the reason it's just in bullet points was really to address the absence of Muslims in British history and place them and our stories alongside the already archived wider British history, social and political, and be able to educate and empower our own community in the importance of creating these tangible connections between our Muslim heritage, but also how those are then represented through our identity in the wider society. And again, I think Professor Ansari mentioned this as well. It's really to advocate a sense of belonging of subsequent British-born and migrant generations that will follow. And then to be able to engage with a wider audience and engage the purpose and to promote an understanding and awareness about who Muslims are and our contributions and our lives in Britain and our connections that, as Professor Ansari has just mentioned, go back centuries. And it's not something that we're taught at school. And that's the final point, to introduce Muslim heritage in the context of wider British history, which then can be put into the classroom. And I think that's very topical. For the past, I guess, about 10 years or so, quietly there's the decolonisation conversation has been had, first in small groups, and then the voices have got louder and louder. And I think the past 2 weeks have really brought to the fore why that's really important. And even we've had a lot of contact from teachers to either say that they're already using our educational resources, which are created from archival material that we've gathered, but also begging for more, to ask, how can we represent our communities, especially when their classrooms are representative of a really diverse, a diverse community, which isn't just white British. But what we want to do with the histories that we create is not to show them as an isolated, this is the Muslim community and this is what we do, but to show them in a broader, wider British context. So we're seen as part of British history and not, a separate entity.
So if I can just ask you, Sadiya, just so we can knit it all together, very quickly, tell us about the project you and I, and Tanya, of course, did that concerns this particular period of time in Woking. And for that, I think you will need the slides, Mijambe.
So I think that's probably slide 3. So go back to slide 2 afterwards. But I'm not going to talk about all of the people individually, because I think it would be great for people to go online and see the map, and eventually, after things have settled down in the wider world, they'll be able to take the physical map and download the maps from the website, or pick up physical maps and be able to connect with the history through those. So it'll be slide, I think, 10 on your slideshow.
Is it 7? 7.
I don't know.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So for me, again, if I speak about the project, actually, let me talk about the project from the project point of view first. So the project point of view, this was a slightly more unique project, rather than, we weren't expecting to stay in the Black Muslims, which were both purely contemporary collectors, collecting and documenting archives, whereas the archiving the heritage of Britain's first purpose-built mosque was both a contemporary collecting project, but also the Shah Jahan Mosque already had some physical archive material, which we helped them with a professional archivist to actually fully catalogue. And now the mosque has a physical catalogued archive, which researchers can go and research and use as historical documentation and as proper research. So for us, we were able to do something that we haven't been able to do before, and is actually work with historical documents. And then from that, the trails came about as another way of us to be able to share that information at a community level, at a wider level, where we can actually learn from it, taking it outside of the expert field or the historic and the academic field, and something that we can engage with more widely. And what I found with the trails was, especially the one at Brookwood, I think Tariq, are you going to be explaining what the trails are afterwards? So I can just talk.
I will go into the trails a bit more with Tanya later on. But if Brother Mijan, if you can go down a slide onto 7, so people can see the images of the Woking project. There we go. So
for me, from a personal perspective, what I found most exciting about this project was in one space was all of this history that Professor Ansari just spoke about. In one place. So the history from what we gathered at Brookwood Cemetery, from the people that are buried there, and their connectedness to Islam, to how Islam was introduced and established within Muslim communities in Britain, but also their global connections to the empire, connections to everyday life, everyday people, also to both world wars. In one of the images you can see a picture of the Peace Gardens, which was where British Muslim soldiers were once buried. And for me, it was just really exciting to be able to visit places, to meet people, and to learn about people that from history that all had a connection to laying down the foundations of what being a British Muslim is. I think Professor Ansari mentioned the British Muslim Society, which was one of the first sort of Muslim organisations, part of which were a lot of well-known early British Muslims. The story also is of the early British convert, British white middle class, upper class converts, as well as the converts from different ethnic and racial groups, which we didn't know existed, or at least I didn't know existed. So outside of the academic and the historians, groups that we just didn't know that existed. So for us as a project, it's really important to be able to bring those stories from outside of the academic realm, if you like, and bring them down to our level, and to be able to connect with them as British Muslims today, but also be able to connect the importance of their stories with our stories and understand how important it is to be able to see ourselves in that context, because as British Muslims, we never really see ourselves represented in the archives or in museums or heritage organisations. So for us, it's really important to be able to put ourselves in that position, and then when it comes to actually collecting contemporary archives, to be able to see the importance of us within that space.
So just to make clear that later on in the series, we will go into quite detail about the history of the Shah Jahan Mosque, how it came about, who founded it, and the mission that came about, that was founded in that area, which is why we're not going into that right now. But what I would like is, Sadiya, as well as the trails, which myself and Tanya will go into in a little bit more detail, what other ways did the project try to make this fabulous heritage more accessible? So I of course helped you collect some oral histories. That was one of the ways. Do you want to just list some of the other ways in which we've tried to make the history accessible from this fabulous area?
Actually, this point is relevant for all of the projects that we do. So it's really important for us to be able to collect the historical, to collect the archives, because they're a primary resource, and that they're actual witness statements to the past and of our lives. And we're finding that because nobody else is doing that, it gives us the opportunity to be able to present an authentic voice. So once we've collected all the oral histories and photographs and documents, and literally anything that anybody wants to give us at the moment, which is just digital, we don't have the capacity to physically collect anything at the moment. But what we then do with them is we create exhibitions, educational resources which are related to Key Stage 2 and 3, history, geography, PHSC. I'm not quite sure which other lessons that they can relate to, but quite a few I'm told that they're used in madrasa classes, heritage workshops. The Islamic Review, which was a publication, as Professor Ansari mentioned, that was first published at the Shah Jahan Mosque. And we created our own sort of commemorative version of it. Again, that just sort of details all the diversity, if you like, of the community and of all the histories that were present in working. What else? Podcasts and events. Heritage Open Days, tours that we have with mosques and museums, but booklets, everything that we've ever created, everything is online. So we've got booklets, educational resources, all of our events, family history plans, and we also do lots of workshops for schools, which are all tailor-made to what the school needs, really. And then we relate it all back using the primary resources of the oral histories that we've collected.
Fantastic. So as you can hear from that, Sadiya is very, very busy and needs lots and lots of help. So if you want to get involved, because it's this kind of grassroots work that is trying to take this heritage from the books and academia, and in some cases put it there in the first place by collating it. And so, you know, it is these kinds of projects that we really want to try and support moving forward. Now, if I may, I'd like to bring in Sadiya's colleague, Tanya. But before I ask about your work with Everyday Muslim, Tanya, first, can you tell us very quickly how and why you decided to get involved with this project?
I think the main reason I decided to get involved with the project was, or it does go back to the whole thing about not being able to see myself. So maybe it started from somewhat of a narcissistic place, but I think at the time in which I converted to Islam in 2005, it was clear to see that the impact of people not being able to see themselves, particularly younger people, not being able to see themselves as Muslims outside of their family and their friends and the people who they knew, the effects that was having on them. I work in community, I work in mental health, and I work in culture. And thinking about the intersection of all of these different things, I realized that this was having a negative impact upon people's well-being and on people's sense of self. In the long run, it would lead to having problems in terms of documenting oneself in the context of Britain. And so it just felt very important for myself as a new Muslim. It felt very important for the young people, particularly that I was seeing around me, was asking questions about whether they belong. You know, it's almost as if heritage is like a synonym for belonging when it comes to this discussion about Muslim and Britain. And so because of all these things, I thought, this is a project that I haven't seen before. I haven't seen this replicated anywhere else. There's a difference between taking pictures and, you know, documenting something, but actually having the focus also on preserving what is the pictures and the images and documenting it and realizing that actually the preservation of that is actually vital to how we feel as a community and also how we are seen by other communities and how we see ourselves.
Yeah, that's a very, very passionate explanation. And, you know, it's one that I think resonates probably with most of our viewers. I remember when I met Sadiya, and one of the things I recall her telling me is that sometimes, and it hadn't even occurred to me, and she said to me, you know, sometimes even when the academics want to do the work, if the raw material isn't there, if the oral histories haven't been collated, if the interviews haven't been done, somebody doing a PhD can't always go and do all of those, you know, and a big part of it is that we're not even visible in the archives, let alone at the front end. And like you, that's definitely one of the reasons why I felt so inspired when I saw what Sadiya was doing. But I want to bring you, so we can start tying this all together, Tanya. I want to bring you to the project that you came along to experience with me recently. So you and I recently took the Oxford University's history faculty around one of the outcomes of the project Sadiya has just described. The weather was absolutely awful, I think is fair to say, and we was out in the open. But beyond the weather, what did you make of it? What did you make of that experience, seeing that raw material finally being presented in an accessible way, and then seeing people who wouldn't normally access it, you know, immerse themselves in it and gain from it? How did that make you feel seeing that?
Well, first of all, just to say that I think there was a real beauty of having the opportunity to be able to go off by yourself and experience things by yourself, but also having a guide there as well who was able to talk more about things. I think there's definitely a benefit as well in doing it in the group, so you can have that experience by yourself and then come and have various different conversations. So first of all, I think that's a beautiful thing, because I was able to witness the various different conversations happening and about the different people who were buried there, about why particular monuments were sort of erected, and just the whole idea of people being able to connect to their own cultures as well. People who aren't Muslim being able to go there and see things that reflects them as well, which just goes back to the whole idea of, I guess, maybe realizing that we're not that dissimilar. We live, we die, we have stories to tell. And I think for people to be able to really look at that and see themselves and ask questions and, have so many, it was almost like watching a realization. It was like watching a realization of like, oh, we're not different. We do this in our culture, and just so many stories come into life in that space. I liked, for me personally speaking, I really like I'm a little bit of a, conspiracy theorist. So I like the whole idea about, oh, Queen may be buried just there. We don't know, all of these various different things, all of these different histories, all of these different tales existing in one place. It was just really beautiful to witness and to be a part of it also. I was proud to be a part of it.
Thank you. And just to help our viewers connect, Mijamba, if we could have the slide which has trail number 1 written on it, just so our viewers can see these self-guided trails. So it's the slide number 9 from what I can see. So hopefully some of you can see this. We've got up here trail number 1, and what we developed down there was 2 self-guided trails. And that's what Tanya means when she says that what is really nice is you can go off and explore this stuff yourself. Of course, you can try and get hold of a guide, but our point in developing these trails was to make them sustainable, in that, it was something that we could walk away from and leave in the hands of the community. And the community have very much embraced this. So these maps, which are available in physical form as well. I don't know if you can see my screen, but I've got a couple at home sitting with me right now. And these are the maps that you can actually go and pick up in person when you go to either the mosque, the cemetery office, or the local history centre. And in that first trail, what we've done is we've tried to connect up the 3 most important heritage spaces in Woking for Muslims. And actually they are 3 of the most important spaces in the entire country. On the left, if we start there, you'll see it's the Shah Jahan Mosque and what is known as the Sir Salah Young Memorial Hall, both of which were founded around 1889. Then we also have, oh, you're flipping the screen, okay. And then we also have what is known as the Peace Gardens just around the corner, which Sadiya mentioned briefly, where soldiers, British Muslim soldiers that died in the First World War and the Second World War, and during our research we discovered French Muslim soldiers that died as well were buried there until recently, when they were moved to the third space, which is in the bottom left corner of the map, which is the Brookwood Cemetery, broadly speaking, but within it is what was originally known as the Mohammedan Cemetery. And of course, we all know that's a relatively derogatory term today. So nowadays it's just known as the Muslim burial ground. Now this space was actually founded and set aside for Muslims in 1884. Now, as far as we're aware, and of course, Professor Ansari, feel free to jump in and correct me. As far as we're aware, this was the first dedicated, designated space for Muslims in the entire country. So it predates even the mosques up in Liverpool, as far as we're aware. But as you're probably gathering, all of this history and heritage is so new, it's so fresh, that we expect it to possibly be turned over and hopefully more discoveries come about. So that's the first trail. It broadly explains the importance and significance of all three spaces. And to do that, you will need some kind of vehicle. You can actually get the train between the mosque and the cemetery, but otherwise, you will need some kind of vehicle. Now, if we flip to the second slide, which is the one that myself, Tanya, and the history faculty at Oxford University really immersed ourselves in. This is a walking trail which is centered around the ancient Muslim burial sites. And the reason why this is they're all significant, but the individuals on this trail really do bring home so much of what Professor Ansari was telling us earlier. And it really highlights the kind of global interconnectivity Britain had with the Muslim world. You've got some absolutely fascinating individuals buried there, and some of them we've highlighted because of their significance. And I'll just quickly run through some names. So we've got an Ottoman princess there, not just any old Ottoman princess. She was the last and final Ottoman princess. She's buried there. We've actually got another princess buried there called Musbah Haidar, who is a direct descendant of the Prophet ﷺ himself. Then we've got some of the individuals the professor mentioned, Sir Archibald Hamilton, Lord Headley, Marmaduke Pictou, and it comes right up to Dame Zaha Hadid, who of course is the very famous British Iraqi architect. And these are just some of the highlights. And in the top right-hand corner, you will see number 16, the missing Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam, because as many of you are aware, nobody is certain of the exact whereabouts of his grave, though we know he is buried in that plot. And so this is a map, this is a trail that people can go and pick up or download from the Everyday Muslim website and actually walk around and locate these graves themselves. And as you can see, we've put some background there to help contextualize it and to help make it accessible. And in essence, what we've tried to do, and this is what we tried to do with the entire project when myself, Tanya, and Sadiya were working there with people like Professor Ansari and a host of other academics and professionals that you will meet through this series. The aim was to take what the likes of Professor Ansari do and bring it to the surface and make it visible and, more importantly, accessible to the everyday Muslim. And that's a deliberate pun right there, okay? And so just to wrap this up a little bit, I don't want to take all the credit away from Professor Ansari because, of course, Professor Ansari, long before we launched these self-guided trails, I realized when I was working with you that you had already been doing something similar at the cemetery with local schools. Do you want to just tell us about that?
Right, yes. My colleague, Dr. Edwin Madigan, who is a specialist of the First World War, and I, we are at Royal Holloway. We took the initiative of injecting cultural and religious diversity into the school curriculum. And this, of course, is becoming a major issue in the present context. But the whole business of Black history, BAME history, and so on. What a place does it occupy, right from primary school through to university levels? So, like your heritage trail, and I must congratulate you. It's an immense immensely valuable project, systematizing, that particular kinds of knowledge in the way that you've done. And it offers a very valuable resource. So like your heritage trail, this is a local history project designed for particularly for Woking High School. And what we have done for a number of years is each year we take around 30 pupils on the tour of the Woking Mosque, the Peace Garden at Horsell Common, and Brookwood Cemetery. And what we do is that at the mosque, students learn about the history of Muslim community of Woking and the important place it has in the town's heritage. At the Peace Garden, we explain the history of the burial ground, the troops who were originally interred there. They had to be dug up because of vandalism that took place and then transferred to the military cemetery of Brookwood. And the role of Muslim troops in the armed forces. And our final stop, so it's a half-day tour, is the Brookwood Military Cemetery, where students hear much about the sacrifices of Muslim soldiers in the region of 400,000, of whom fought in the First World War. How many of us know that there were nearly 500,000 of those people fighting for so-called king and country. And this has been an annual thing. And the feedback from the school has been extremely positive. Students gain a huge amount from the visit in terms of their, I'm told, spiritual, moral, social, and cultural education, as well as development of British values, particularly relating to respect for each other's faith. And significantly, there is engagement of non-Muslim students with local history, with which they are sort of less familiar. So several students have never visited, for example, the Woking Mosque among these. And what was interesting was that this project was started while these commemorations of the First World War centenary were taking place between 1914 and 1918. And because that was actually, the top of the agenda for the country as a whole, in terms of commemoration, the visits that we organized played an important part in embracing British Muslim remembrance or ceremonies. But as you can appreciate, its relevance in the current debates around the desperate need for incorporation of BAME history in the national curriculum is palpable.
Yeah, I think one of the most fascinating things in everything you've said, Professor Ansari, apart from feeling quite jealous of all those young school children getting a personalized tour from you, is that, it's very rare for academics to come down to that level and do that kind of grassroots work. And so to make it so accessible, is not only wonderful in your example, but of course that is the point in the discussion we're having today. It's not just about, sort of collating this history. It's not just about recording this history. It's also about making it accessible, making it visible, so that nobody can ignore it in any cultural national debate. And I think that's one of the reasons why, we're hoping over the course of these 6 episodes, we can at least introduce some aspects of that British Muslim heritage. And in each case, we are going to try to bring people who are also working at a grassroots level for every single episode to try and show that connection between the likes of the giants that we have in Professor Ansari and other academics that hopefully you guys will meet along the way, whose shoulders we end up standing on when we try to make this work more accessible. So before I go, I just want to say, if Tanya, if you don't mind, could you just tell me what you found as one of the most kind of inspiring moments in working with Sadiya in this project?
I mean, to be truthful, every moment on this project is exciting and is inspiring, because it is collating our history as Muslim, collating our stories. People, even in the process of interviewing people and them hearing their story back and hearing someone say, wow, you did that, you achieved that, you realize that everybody has done something to be, like celebrated. Everyone has done something that is phenomenal. We are, in terms of contributing to Britain and in terms of contributing to the story of Britain, and how Britain sees itself, we've done so much, but at the same time, we're not really recognized for that. And so just connecting with people realizing how valuable their stories are, as a community, listening to other people's stories and realizing that in our diversity, we have multiple stories to celebrate. I think that's probably the thing that keeps me saying yes to all the various different projects.
Fantastic. Don't go anywhere, because I have a list of questions now. So the first one, I think this is directed to you, Sadiya. It's from a Rashida Hussein, and it says, how can we be involved, Sadiya?
Thank you for asking. I've got a long list of explaining how. So at the moment, COVID means that we can't function in the normal way, so we can't go out and have face-to-face interviews. So what we did a few weeks ago was launch a campaign to create our own history, and we're asking people to record their own oral history interviews using a phone, using any kind of recording equipment that they have. Record their histories. If they need help with questions, we can supply them, and also to start collecting virtually. So we're collecting, let me look, photographs, diaries, journals. People are sending photocopies of old passports, letters, audio recordings, family recipes, what else? Academic research. So we've got, old PhDs, anything that's related to British Muslim heritage, personal stories, academic, literally anything you can think of. And what we're doing is we're going to digitize all of those, and then make them available. We're going to catalogue them as well, so they'll all be catalogued properly. Create a digital archive, and make that available on the website as alongside everything else.
Fantastic. And I think this one's probably going to go to you, Professor Ansari. It's from an Abdullah Muhammad. To what extent did the Liverpool and Woking missions cooperate with each other, or were they parallel movements? Which, second question, did Quilliam attend any events at Woking?
The first one, I think that what we need to understand is that there was a certain amount of interaction that took place between so the Liverpool sort of like Muslim Institute at the end of the 19th century, before before the Woking Mosque was kind of re-established in 1912, because there were, if I might say there was a period, or there was a hiatus between 1899 when Leitner, who actually started the whole project, who was instrumental in building the mosque and the memorial, who established kind of an institute there. When he died in 1899, the whole sort of site, the estate, went into disrepair and didn't actually begin to operate as a living entity until 1913 or 1213, when Khaja Kamaluddin arrives, and luckily, fortunately, he went there. So what we are really talking about is the connection, because that there is there in the late 19th century, when it isn't really operating as a functioning, living mosque for any great deal of time. I mean, there was a festival organized there, and Muslims from various parts of the country visited it. and there is no record of Abdullah Quilliam visiting it in that particular period. So when you say, is there a connection between the LMI and the Woking Mosque? I wouldn't have thought so. As you know, Quilliam actually left England in the earlier part of the 20th century, and so he wasn't going to be connected. We went to Istanbul, but there for quite a while. Returned as Henri Lyon in later on, was situated in London, and so in that later period, he would have been connected with the mosque, although he was also conducting his own lectures and so on in London itself. So, as we know, he was actually buried, in Woking. So there must have been that kind of connection there. And he would have been associated with Muslims in London, who were also associated with very closely associated with the Muslim mission at Woking right the way through from 1913 onwards. But when you say Liverpool and Woking, I think that the connection sort of would have been there earlier on. And one of the stories is that, which I think suggests that was there, was a couple of students, a student dies in London. They request the burial to take place at the Brookwood Cemetery, as you suggested. It's there from 1884 onwards. Leitner refuses that request, so then they have to take the body to Liverpool, and it's buried there. And there is a lot of correspondence between, through the newspapers, the Gazette in London, which tells us that Quilliam was very, very critical of what Leitner had done, and said that what right had he to refuse that. This is a place for Muslims. The mosque is for Muslims. This is not his property. This belongs to Muslims of Britain. So in terms of that particular sort of idea, the connection between Liverpool and Woking, I would have thought that would have been fairly tenuous. The other question you asked about was?
So the other question was, did Quilliam attend any events at Woking?
I would have thought so, certainly in the interval period, while he wasn't closely connected with it. There isn't any evidence of him contributing to the monthly journal, Islamic Review, where one finds that he is certainly mentioned, but there isn't that kind of close association that, say, for example, people like Abdullah Yusuf Ali, Mahmoud Pictol, Sayyid Amir Ali had, even the Aga Khan had, with the Woking Mosque. And there, it's I suppose, quite curious that he wouldn't have had that. But as I was saying, he left Britain under rather dubious circumstances. He returns under a different name. People then, of course, challenge him, and he owns up to it. But what we find is that, until his death in 1932, there is very little that connects him with the Woking Mosque. Although I'm sure he remained a Muslim, and he would have continued to interact with Muslims in the sort of, in London, as well as those connected with the mosque. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Professor. Just to Abdullah Muhammad, we will have a couple of Quilliam experts on next week, one of whom I've just seen has logged into this talk. And so I'm sure we can always raise that towards the end then as well. I've got a message here from somebody called Hem, who is pointing out that they've done a dissertation, Sadiya, that they think might be of use for your archives. So I'm sure at some point they can send that across to you. Then we've got a question here from, okay, so from a Tariq, which says, what are the best 3 books on this interesting topic? Well, seeing as we've got Professor Ansari with us today, I'd say pretty much anything written by him. And then over the next few weeks, you'll be coming across several people, several amazing scholars, writers and authors who have also written wonderful books on these topics. So yeah, I guess watch this space is the best thing I can say there. All right, and then we've got from Rashida Hussain, do these trail trips have to be booked or can people just turn up? So what needs to be made clear is these are self-guided. So these trail maps, which I'm holding up here, they're in the physical form. Is that right? No, that's upside down, sorry. Okay, so there's number 1 and there's number 2. And they open up in this way, they're huge, okay? And they look like that when they're open. And essentially you can pick them up if you turn up at the Shah Jahan Mosque, at the cemetery office, at the Brookwood Cemetery Society, or the History Centre, and you can pick them up in physical form and then guide yourself around, okay? Or you can download them from everydaymuslim.org as PDFs and guide your way around, okay? Right, let's see. We've got Rashida Hussain again, I think. Is that, yep. Are there other such, sorry. Wait, do these, okay, we've got from someone who's asking about establishing Khilafah in Britain. I think that might be for another day, okay. Are there other such projects in different parts of Britain? So Tanya, do you want to take this? Are you aware of other projects?
I know there are projects focused on, like, for example, there's an organization called Numbi, and they're focused on sort of like Somali heritage. And I know I think there was something in Birmingham that was talked about happening, but I don't know if they started. So I know there's smaller projects, and I think maybe the aim or the dream for me is for all of these projects to connect, you know, because in all of them it's really community based, and it's really not about individual organizations. It's about just getting the history out there. But I think one thing that I do think is that seems unique about Everyday Muslim is the focus on the preservation of what is collected and the information that comes forward.
Thank you very much.
There's also in Scotland, there's Colourful Heritage, and I think they're collecting, I think it's broadly South Asian heritage, and they are also archiving from what I remember. But in terms of heritage, there's loads of projects that are done around heritage, but there's very few that are archiving them. So if anybody's involved in any of those projects, please just archive them, put them in, you know, in your local archive organizations, or just let us know that they exist. So when people, because we get a lot of requests from academics and historians and just communities that just want to get to know more about their heritage. So if we have that information, we can then pass it on to them and just make it available on our website that they exist.
Yeah, and just to add to that, there are lots of history and heritage projects up and down the country, you know, on Muslims in Britain. But one of the key differences, as Sadiya has pointed out, is that, you know, one of the primary objectives of Everyday Muslim and the other project that she pointed out, which is Colourful Heritage, is that there is a focus on preserving the history for future generations, and not just to have an objective that, you know, ends up with an exhibition or something and then you move on. So it really is about archiving is one of the big, you know, focuses here. Okay, just going through some more questions. Somebody who's a madrasa teacher, Sadiya, is asking where can they access the resources and the kind of material that you've spoken about to use in their lessons, because they like to do things like this as well.
So it's quite easy. Just go on the website, and under the education tab, we've got all of the projects, and they have related educational resources. So we've got lesson plans and worksheets. There's also audio and video content as well. So it's quite accessible. So education, and then all of 3 projects are there. In addition to that, we've also got a mosque archiving guide, which comes under that tab. So any mosques out there who are thinking about, starting an archive or have, which we know there's quite a few mosques up and down the country with boxes and boxes and boxes of paper. It's just a short guide to help them to start sort of sorting that paper out, and start to at least for themselves categorizing it, and then we're hoping at some point they'll start thinking about archiving it.
So just to add to what Sadiya is saying there, it's a culture that we're hoping slowly will start to develop within our communities, whether it's a mosque, whether it's a madrasa, whether it's any kind of institute. This culture of archiving what we're doing, making sure it's preserved for future generations, and not just done away with when, say, for example, a committee or something changes. Okay, just a quick question here we've got from Tariq again. This isn't me, by the way, just in case you're starting to wonder. Have any members from the royal family converted? So Professor Ansari, besides going into conspiracy theories about Queen Elizabeth, do you want to tell them about one of the individuals buried in Woking, Hamilton, who was of royal blood?
Sorry, Hamilton, did you say?
Yes. He was, the gentleman who's related to the royals. He's the only one that we know of for sure that converted to Islam, isn't it?
I'm afraid no. I won't be able to tell you much about Hamilton. Can you sort of elaborate on that a bit?
Oh, sorry, maybe, unless of course I've said his name wrong. I'll actually read the one that from this guide. So yes, so it's Abdullah Charles Edward Archibald Watkin Hamilton, 5th and 3rd Baronet, British Knight and Baron. So he's actually buried right next to Lord Headley in Woking, and he was known as the only Mohammedan Baronet. He was allegedly related, as far as I'm aware, he was related to the English royal family. So that's the only one we have hard evidence of. So any kind of other rumours that you're aware of, we can't verify on here, I'm afraid. So that's the only one that we know of.
No.
And now let's see, we've still got quite a few to get through, I think. Right, let's see, what are the best 3 books we've done? Are there any efforts being made to incorporate this knowledge into school curriculums, Sadiya?
Yes, so all the educational resources are Key Stage 3 and I think I said 3 and 4. Yeah, 3 and 4. And we already work with schools in working with them to bring that into the curriculum. They are already being used, and they're freely available. They're also available on the TESS website, which is a website for educational resources for teachers. So they're accessible in different ways. So if they haven't heard about the project, then they have that access on their website. So we're trying our best.
Yep, thank you very much. So although there are efforts being made, that's not to suggest that this history has been integrated into the actual curriculum yet. But as Sadiya has pointed out, the resources are being developed, and we are always encouraging teachers of mainstream schools and madrasas to access those resources and use them accordingly to teach some of this heritage. Now, Brother Mizan, I think you've said to me that somebody wants to ask a question directly. Is that right? Shall I hand over to you? That is.
Bismillah, assalamu alaikum. I didn't, just to be clear, I didn't request to ask this directly. I submitted a question and he said, would you like to? I said, if you don't understand the question, if I must. So I would prefer not to have to ask directly. So apologies. Okay.
Oh, so has the question been answered?
No, it hasn't been answered. So we've got like the King offers, but first of all, so much gratitude to everybody for facilitating today, the producer, the academics, the organisers. Beautiful, really great way to spend the afternoon. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you.
God bless you, bless us with you, inshallah. So 8th century, we've got Offa's coin. 9th century, we've got like the Ballycotton cross. Then there's like a big jump, right, to like the 15th century, where we've got Elizabeth and Murad III. Then again, another jump to around the 17th century, then the converts. So there's like some gaps. And I'm particularly interested in like that really big jump between like 8th, 9th century up to like the 15th century. Like, what's the story? Like,
I guess the only person remotely qualified in here would be you, Professor Ansari.
Okay, right. So what we find, I'm afraid there is this gap. But what we find is that when we talk about the gold dinar, we are talking about this interaction that takes place, let's say, through the Roman Empire, through Rome, with the Middle East. And so you find that there's sort of these bits of evidence that suggest that there is that interaction taking place. The other thing that we have to understand is that Muslims are actually very active in different parts of Europe. So, from almost the inception of Islam, let's say around about 708 onwards, North African Muslims have crossed over to Spain, and they establish several kingdoms there in Spain, which last from round about 700 for several centuries through to about 1492, when there's this so-called reconquest actually takes place. So, and there is a huge culture that actually develops in Spain. And there are obviously some interaction taking place between the English at that time and those particular sort of, if you like, communities. And what you find is that broadly speaking, this is the period where a huge amount of knowledge is being transferred from the Muslim world. Translations of Aristotle and so on, so period of Renaissance that is there. What we find is that they take this knowledge and then bring it back to England, and engage with that knowledge in their own way. But they don't turn into Muslims. That's absolutely clear. So you have this business happening. Muslims, in fact, from 700 onwards, penetrate deeply into Europe and get as far as Poitiers when they are stopped. We are talking about 712 AD when this happens. So they get as far as that, but they don't actually cross over, the channel into Britain. And then, of course, from that point onwards, there is that interaction, as I said, taking place between Muslims. They become part of Europe in a variety of ways. We have this interaction taking place also through the emergence of the Ottoman Empire. They become part of Europe in a variety of ways, coming right up to Vienna as well. So that kind of situation actually happens. But if one is thinking about, well, is there a Muslim presence in Britain, in England, and so on, between, let's say, 700 and this the sort of later period that I mentioned? Then there is very little evidence for that. What we find is that if you look at Nabil Matar's work, which is about Muslims in Britain, looking at the Tudor period, then there are certain things, but we are again really talking about the 16th century and 16th century onwards. I'm not saying that there isn't interaction taking place between, say, North Africa, piracy, corsair, and so on, and Britain in that period between, let's say, 700 and 1500 or so onwards. But as far as, if you like, Muslim presence, development of Muslim communities in England, in Britain, the British Isles is concerned, there is very little evidence to suggest that that actually exists.
And Professor Ansari, is it fair to say that, this is still to be mapped, and the research, of course, still needs to be done in greater depth and hasn't been done in the past, given the discussion we're having?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's crucial that actually takes place. There are some academics who have worked on this particular period, right? But as I say, they haven't come up with anything, significantly, historically important to suggest that there was a presence of Muslim communities in the British Isles in that particular period.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. I must inform you right now that the following questions are also probably aimed at you, so do prepare yourself. So one of them is from Reardon, who is asking, would you consider Inayat Khan as a strong symbolic figure of British Islam? And for some reason that's just skipped.
We're talking about Maulvi Inayat Khan,
yes,
who operated primarily as a Sufi. So, in fact, he travels very widely. He comes to Britain and then moves across. He marries an American woman, spends a certain amount of time in Russia, and then eventually actually settles in France, brings up the family there. And his is an interesting story, but he develops his own sort of, if you like, tariqah, his own order, and there is a history of that order. It's very live. It exists in the United States much more than elsewhere. And I think there are bits and pieces of that here as well. What is, I think, interesting is that he is from the Chishtiya order in India, and that's a monist order. They are sort of very much into the idea of Wahdatul Wujud, that the whole universe is the divine. There isn't that sort of idea of Wahdatul Shuhud, which means transcendence, separation of God from his creation. And he sort of is part of that kind of sort of, idea of divinity. Rumi in Persia was from that, Sadi and so on, some of these. So what I think is interesting is to think about, well, what happens to his heritage? So he spends very little time in England. But if you know, Nurun Nisa Inayat Khan was his daughter. And she came to, when the Second World War erupted, she came to Britain. And she then, of course, was inducted into the what's known as the Special Operative Executive, Operation Executive in the 90s. And she was dropped as an intelligence officer, behind the enemy lines in the very early 1940s. She was betrayed, and she was captured, and she was taken to the concentration camps. She was then, after being tortured, executed at the concentration camp of Dachau. And she's got the George Cross in Britain. So as far as Inayat Khan himself is concerned, there is that whole sort of, if you like, Sufi tradition that he pursues. And that's a very complex tradition and very different from the scriptural tradition that we have there. But that would be the connection with what we have in Britain today, rather than, and so, in terms of his impact, hasn't been as significant as of some of these other Sufis.
That's very wonderful explanation, and of course, his daughter's now been commemorated with a plaque, and that's
in
something.
St. James's Park, yes, in St. James's Park, yes.
But I have to apologise because Reardon's just pointed out that I've missed the main focus of his question, and which was, do you think Inayat Khan did Inayat Khan promote Islam, or rather a form of Sufism without Islam? I kind of feel like the professor's answered that, Riordan. Can you just nod if you're happy with that? Yeah. Okay, great. We'll move on, and we've got a couple of questions around this theme. First of all, John Spencer is asking for Professor Ansari, do we need to decolonize the curriculum? I think that's going to be an emphatic yes. If so, what does it look like? So sorry to answer the question for you, Professor Ansari.
Absolutely.
Probably wouldn't be doing this if we didn't feel that way. And then our guest from next week, for Yahya Burt, has asked, in this moment where there are huge civil protests in America, and there is a call to decolonize the curriculum in Britain and to recognize imperialism and slavery, what can British Muslims contribute to this reassessment of Britain's history? And I think both questions are kind of in the same ballpark. So do you want to tackle them together, Professor?
No, well, yes. I mean, we were really talking about the national curriculum. And I think academics who feel that this must become, a significant part of what they teach in terms of higher education, must be a very, strong yes, and I think that what they need to do is become quite active about it, active in terms of what they, what's happening in universities themselves, looking at the policies that are actually there at the moment, and trying to inject ideas into those policies, into those sort of like teaching frameworks, which then move the projects forward. So it's not just a question of sort of looking at these curricula in terms of history, though that would be important. It's actually trying to roll those sorts of ideas, the idea of incorporating Muslim history, Muslim contributions, so on, in every field. So, the Department of Mathematics should be incorporating, ideas that bring in sort of the Muslim dimension. Economics, law, in all these areas, higher educational institutions should be asking, the same way that they are asking about equal opportunities, that same way they are asking about, Black curriculum more broadly, that whether, more specifically Muslim, histories, ideas are actually, big incorporated, becoming what I would say an organic part. And that's the important thing to do. If one is looking at, let's say, teaching of the Tudor period, I mentioned Elizabeth I, you could actually be talking about incorporating, those dimensions of that particular history, taking on board, Muslim contributions, Muslim ideas, Muslim sort of, if you like, in interactions, because that is part of British history. That is organically part of British history, which has not been included up to this particular point, and would enrich that particular history, develop an understanding of British history in a very different way to the way that the curriculum is organized at the moment. So that's right. And I think that, there is a huge demand now, isn't there? That, why hasn't slavery, the history of slavery and so on, been taught at the primary level and primary level onwards? Why isn't there the history of the slave trade? Not a significant, I mean, this is a pivotal thing that's been part of British history. So it's organically there. Why has that been excluded from the curriculum? And there are obviously various explanations for why that should be the case. But what we need is certainly a huge kind of drive, both publicly, at the policy level, and from teachers, academics, and so on and so forth, for that to actually happen.
Thank you very much, Professor. But just before we wrap up, Tanya, I want to hear your thoughts as well on the question. So I'll repeat it again. You know, what can British Muslim contribute to this reassessment of Britain's history?
Okay,
Sorry
so,
to put you on the spot.
I feel like I am talking very much from my feelings, from my emotions. I'm not an academic, but I am a person who works with people and sees the impact of not being represented, sees the impact of misrepresentation in universities, not just from a sort of like decorative, like this decorates our life point of view, but actually this is central to how we live, how we see ourselves, how we feel confident as people going out into the world. And for the most part, I don't feel like working in mental health, working particularly with a lot of students, universities aren't really safe spaces for particularly BAME young people entering them. A lot of people walk into university and actually have to go through processes of like counseling and go through various other processes to sort of like get over the trauma that the university experience has had on them. So as Muslims, I think we need to be aware of what some of our young people are going through, and not just young people, but what some people have been through. I think as Muslims generally, we have to ask ourselves, do we do this in other way to other people within the community, people outside of the community? We just need to have a lot of honest conversations. How do we contribute to, sorry to be all like radical, but how do we contribute to this system that is actually disenfranchising people? How do we uphold this system? And yes, that may be due to the histories that we have in connection with England and how that has impacted upon us. But it feels like we're in a moment where there is a recognition that this, how we're currently living, how we're currently educating ourselves isn't really fit for purpose. But what are we going to do after this point? And that's what I think we need to ask ourselves as Muslims. Are we willing to be the change? Are we willing to change our conditions, you know?
Can you think of any practical ways that British Muslims might contribute to the reassessment? And I am conscious of the fact that Mijan Bhai has told me I've gone way over time. So if you can, I know I've put you on the spot again, Tanya, any practical ways that you can think of?
In so many ways, and I guess it depends on where are you, what do you do? You know, British Muslims, that's a very big thing. We occupy so many different spaces. If it's in academia, then I think, as the professor said, as academics, you have to be like really conscious about being able to say, this isn't right, we need to change this, and just keep having these conversations despite how uncomfortable they may be. And sometimes it may feel like, oh, okay, am I about to, you know, commit like career suicide? But we have to be able to have these conversations, you know, in whatever sphere. We just have to be brave enough and bold enough to be able to bring up these topics wherever we exist within society.
Thank you for that very succinct answer. And of course, for that to happen, those spaces have to be safe. And I think that's the biggest fear for a lot of people working in these various spaces. But we do have to wrap it up there. And if anybody else doesn't have any further questions, please forgive me, because I've gone well over time. And if Mijan Bhai's microphone was actually working, he might have jumped in and shouted at me, but it isn't. So I'm going to have to end it here. Thank you all for your questions. Please don't forget to join us for our second episode at the same time next week, when we will have two experts discussing Britain's first ever Sheikh al-Islam, Abdullah Quilliam, and his links to the Ottomans, as well as local politics and trade unionism. So it's a side of the Sheikh that most people, even those who are interested in him, will probably know absolutely nothing about, as much of it is based on very, very fresh research, and it's very, very exciting. To register for that, it's the same process as it was for this episode, okay, via Islamic Courses. Thank you all again for joining us, and thank you again to our guests, Professor Ansari, Sadiya and Tanya. You've all been absolutely fabulous and made this a riveting conversation. We hope you all have a great evening. Goodbye. and salams.